Okay, so the first thing I'm doing is making sure that my dough is cold, pliable, and relaxed. So this dough has been in the fridge overnight, and so has my butter. So you want your butter and your dough to be the same consistency. So both of them should be cold, pliable, and relaxed. Pliable meaning when I bend it in half, it doesn't just snap right down the middle, and it actually has some give to it. So my butter can use a little bit more time at room temperature, but I'm gonna start rolling my dough out. While I'm rolling my dough, my butter will start to get to the correct temperature. So I have my rolling pin and I have my bench flour, my dough scraper, and a pastry brush. Okay, so I'm gonna flour my board, flour my dough, and work to keep this in a rectangular shape. I want to make sure that I'm not kind of rounding on my ends. I want it to be as close to a rectangle as possible, and I'm going to be measuring as I go so that my length is twice the width. So my width should be about 10 or 11 inches. My length should be about 20 to 22 inches long. Okay? And my thickness should be about 1/4 of an inch. When you're working with lamination, your measurements are very important. So you want to make sure that you are abiding by these rules. The cleaner you work, the better your final product is going to be. Every once in a while, I just make sure that my dough is not sticking to my bench. I regather some flour, and I use my bench scraper to keep my dough nice and rectangular. If your dough starts to get too warm while you're working with it, you have to put it back in the fridge. You always want to work with your dough when it is cold, pliable, and relaxed. Relaxed meaning the gluten proteins have had a chance to relax, meaning they're not overworked. So if your proteins have been overworked, your dough is going to not roll out very nicely, and it's actually going to shrink back into its original size. We're doing this lamination by hand right now, but you can use a machine called a sheeter. A sheeter makes your job go a lot faster. So with a large scale production of croissant or Danish or puff pastry, you would be using that type of a machine. So in Big Shop 1, we show you how to do it by hand as well as how to use the machine. Notice that I'm running my hands underneath the dough. That's so that I'm making sure that I'm not sticking. I'm checking the temperature and the consistency of my dough. And I'm also feeling where I might be a little bit thick or thin, so that I can make sure that not only am I consistent in my measurements in length and width, but also in the thickness. You don't want to be super, super thin on one side and then super thick on another. So I'm going to rotate my dough just because I have short little arms and a 7-month pregnant belly, and I can't reach as far as I used to be able to. So I'm just rotating my dough so that I can make sure that I am rolling evenly at the top and the bottom. Okay, so I'm 16.5 long by 9.5 wide. Okay, so I'm just going to extend my length a little bit on this end because it's a little bit thick down here. And because we've developed the gluten matrix in our dough, I'm actually able to stretch this with my hands. So on some of the pieces that are a little bit thick, I'm actually going to kind of stretch it like a pizza dough. If you did not develop your gluten while you were mixing, you would have a really tough time doing that. Okay, so the cleaner that your lines are, meaning the more rectangular they are, the straighter they are, the more you're paying attention to your measurements and your temperatures, the better your final product will be in the end. Okay, my butter is at a nice temperature. Again, cold, pliable, and relaxed. And that's so that you have consistency between your dough and your butter. So we're going to lock our butter into this dough and fold the dough over on top of it. So you want them to be the same consistency, pliable, cold, so that your dough sticks to it. And then as you're rolling it out, you want your butter to be soft enough that on your folds, so as you're rolling and you're folding, that the butter is not so cold that it's breaking into chunks. And then when it breaks into chunks, it's very thick, it's gonna break through your dough, you're gonna have butter all over your station. So really important to pay attention to the consistency of your butter just as much as you're paying attention to the consistency of your dough. Okay, so the inside of my butter is just a little bit cold, but I'm going to use this time to check the measurement of my butter. So you want your dough to be about twice the size of your butter. So since it's in this nice little packet here, I can measure it against my dough and see if I need to extend the dough just a little bit, or I can also manipulate the butter. So I'm going to choose to roll the dough a little bit longer. And you want to leave yourself a little bit of a border around your butter so that you have an area where you can lock your butter into the dough. So you want a slight border around the edge so that the dough will stick to the dough. Perfect. Okay, so my butter is pliable, meaning I can bend it and it's not going to snap in half because it's super, super cold. Nice and pliable. And I want to make sure that I'm brushing my flour off from the dough before I add the butter in. And this is because the flour will act as a barrier between the dough and the butter when it's baking. So if this gets locked into the butter, it kind of creates a resistance so that when your croissants or your Danish or your puff pastry is baking, that steam that is coming from the butter, which is what is making your product rise, the flour, if you don't brush it off, is going to prevent the steam from pushing up on the layer of dough that's above that layer of butter. So it's an important step to take. Make sure that there's no flour left on your dough before we add the butter. Okay, so we're just going to peel the parchment off. And flip the butter onto the dough. And because it is cold, pliable, and relaxed, we can move the butter if we're not perfectly centered. Okay. So my butter is half the size of my dough portion. And I have a slight border of dough around the butter so that when I fold this portion of dough on the top over the butter, I have an area that I can lock the dough onto the dough and seal that butter in so that it is not going to leak out while I'm laminating. So I fold the dough right over the butter so that it butts up against the butter. Okay, so my dough is still cold, pliable, and relaxed, and it folds right over my butter. So it creates a nice seam at the top, and it lines up perfectly with the dough that's on the bottom. So I'm going to brush the flour off the other side of the dough. And this is called my lock-in phase. So I am pressing the dough on the border that I left around the butter. I'm pressing the dough onto the layer of dough that's below it. And that's enveloping the entire piece of butter so that it does not leak out. Okay, so my edges that I now just... Yeah, those were from yesterday. Thank you. My edges that I smushed just kind of sealed onto itself on my border is now going to come up. So again, this is my lock-in phase. So I'm locking the butter into the dough so that it's completely sealed in, kind of like a letter inside an envelope. I do the bottom. And this is the classic method of lamination. There are other techniques that are more modern that are available. Okay, so now I'm gonna flip this dough over so that all of those seams that I just folded up are on the bottom. And now I'm ready to do my first fold. So this is the seam from where I folded the dough onto the butter. So this is where the dough butts up right against the butter. Every time you do a fold, you should be rotating your dough 90 degrees. And that's so that your gluten is being stretched in all directions. So essentially what you're going to do is make sure that your seam is on your right every time you do a fold. So I'm going to rotate this so that my seam is on my right. And now I'm going to do my first fold. Okay, flour your bench, flour your dough. And now because your butter and your dough are both cold, pliable, and relaxed, I'm going to be able to roll this out just as thin as I did before, and my butter will roll right along with my dough, and I won't have little pieces kind of cracked up inside. And that will maintain beautiful, beautiful layers so that your final croissant will have what we call a honeycomb texture on the inside. And that's all those beautiful flaky layers that when you bite into it, it kind of looks like, you know, it's all over your shirt, all over your table. It looks like you smashed it into a million pieces. That's the flakiness that you want in a croissant. Okay, so my edges are just gonna be a little bit thicker because of the lock-in technique that I used. And that's expected, that's gonna happen. Okay, so I'm gonna rotate my dough just so that I can reach. Like I mentioned, I have little arms and a big belly right now. So I am remembering where my seam is, right here on my right. I'm rotating this only so that I can reach because I want to work smarter, not harder. Okay, so I'm just rotating it so that I'm working in front of me and so that I can reach the dough in all of its spots and roll it to the appropriate thickness. Okay, so notice that I'm moving my body with the dough so that it makes sense. Right? I'm not just staying in one place. What's up?
There's a buffet on the fourth floor if you want to come.
Thank you.
I hope to see you. I think I'm coming next semester.
Good.
Excited.
Okay, so you want to rotate your body so that you are working in front of your dough. You're not just staying static in one place and just trying to move your arms. You're moving your whole body. Okay, so again, trying to keep this as rectangular as possible and keeping my edges all the way around nice and straight and rectangular. And still making sure that I am cold, pliable, and relaxed. Okay, so once again, you want your length to be twice your width. Now it's important to remember that once you incorporate your butter into your dough, you want to be very careful not to puncture your dough. So short fingernails, no bracelets, no rings, nothing that could possibly like nick your dough and puncture it and put little holes in it, because if that happens, your butter is going to leak out and your butter is going to be on your station instead of in your dough, which is then going to turn to layers in the oven, which gives you that beautiful flakiness. So it's all kind of like a domino effect. Okay, so now I'm ready for my first fold. So once again, brush all of your flour off. And we're going to be doing I'm going to start with a 3-fold. So there are 2 types of folds. A 3-fold and a 4-fold, and that is referring to the number of layers that you get in your final dough. So I'm going to, right now I have dough, butter, dough. In a 3-fold, the bottom of your dough, now remember my seam is on my right, bottom of my dough comes about 2/3 of the way up. Make sure that everything is nice and lined up. Brush the flour off, because remember this side was down on my station, so it still has flour on it. And now my top is going to come down to meet the bottom. Okay? Brush your flour off. Okay, I like to kind of stretch those edges, the corners, just to make it perfectly rectangular. Again, all this attention to detail is going to make your final product much better in the end. Okay, so side view, you just went from dough, butter, dough, to dough, butter, dough, dough, butter, dough, dough, butter, dough. So every time you do a fold, your layers are growing exponentially. So I just went from having 1 layer of butter to 3 layers of butter. And each of those layers of butter is going to turn to steam in the oven, and the steam is going to rise and it's going to press up on the layer of dough that's above it, and that is what is making our product nice and flaky. Okay? So your leavening agent in your laminated doughs is steam. Okay? So now I'm going to wrap this in plastic wrap, put it in the fridge, let it chill until it is back to being cold, pliable, and relaxed. Now, when I folded this, I created a new seam, right? So this was my top, it came down. This is my new seam. Think of the seam as like a spine of a book, okay? Like the binding. This is my new seam. I'm going to wrap this nice and tight, put it in the refrigerator. When I take this back out to do my next fold, this seam will go to my right. And then I will continue with the process of rolling so that my length is twice the width. Okay, so we're gonna grab the plastic wrap. Okay, bring the plastic wrap to you, makes it much easier. Pull a piece out. Again, make sure all of your flour is brushed off. Be very gentle with your lamination, treat it like a baby. I'm going to make sure that the bottom is also brushed so that there's no flour settling in my dough. Okay, you want to wrap it nice and tight. Okay, you're going to label it with how many folds you did. So I'm just gonna put with my Sharpie, with my marker, just 1 mark so that I know I did 1 fold. And into the refrigerator it goes.